Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another video with the Monkey Sensing Sense today. And today, I have a special guest. Want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. I'm Tim Derling from Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Pleasure to be on here. I've had Tyler on my show before. Not a few months ago, we are talking about Led Zeppelin. So he wanted to talk some Dokken. So I said, all right, that sounds good. So here we are.
All right. Thanks for being on, Tim. I appreciate it. He's actually my first guest on my show. And I came up with Dokken because I know that you are a big fan of a lot of 80s music and you love 80s Rush. And we were talking about Led Zeppelin. So why not go from the 70s and go to the 80s with Dokken, one of my favorite 80s bands? Where did you come into the whole Dokken story?
Well, I actually came in quite late. I didn't get into them until after they'd broken up in 1989. But I had a friend of mine that had their the four albums they had at the time on cassette, and I listened to a couple of them, and I thought, hey, this stuff's actually pretty good. I All I knew from them basically was Dream Warriors, and I didn't like that. I thought that was a cheesy song. I still kind of think it's a cheesy song. So I wasn't hearing the right songs by them. And all I ever read about them in the rock magazines at the time was how they fought all the time. So they just didn't seem like you know, like why would I bother with a band like that? But they made some good music.
Yeah, that they did. We're actually going to get to that whole album back for the attack in a moment. But where I start with Docking was actually about 10 years ago. I actually have a local library and I was discovering a bunch of music. In fact, I could actually rent CDs and there's this bunch of stuff I could watch on YouTube. And I saw songs and songs. I was getting to Guns N' Roses, Red Hot Chili Peppers. I was really getting to like this whole music renaissance at the time. Because when I was a kid, all I heard was the Beatles. Because a little quick backstory was my growing up, my dad used to take his records and transfer them over to cassette. And all he listened to pretty much was the Beatles and then the solo works going after. It wasn't until I started growing up to where I started to listen to other stuff. And I started to go to the library and borrow CDs and go on the computer and borrow CDs. And I remember getting Under Lock and Key. And it just blew my mind how awesome that record was. Like the riffs, the commerciality of it, if that's even a word. Just everything. That album, I think, is the perfect Dokken record, just because it's just a mix of the heavy and the commercial. And it was an amazing album. And then I started listening to some of the other stuff down the line. But it wasn't until about a year ago I really started to get into more of the 80s bands and just blossoming my love for music in general.
Yeah, cool. I mean, Dokken are just a dependable hard rock band, and I've always thought that they kind of occupy this strange spot when you're talking about bands of that era because they were a little heavier than a lot of the bands that were around. They were heavier than Def Leppard or Bon Jovi or, certainly Poison, but they weren't heavy like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden. They kind of fell somewhere in between. They could be as heavy as anyone, or they could be as commercial as anyone. But they were just a little bit different from the pack, and they sold a lot of albums, but they nowadays really only people that were into 80s rock will know who Dokken were because they didn't have they had a couple of singles that hit the bottom parts of the chart, but they didn't have any big hits. People will say they had big hits that are big fans. They weren't big hits. They were just good songs that were somewhat popular, and maybe the videos were popular.
Especially nowadays, I feel like they get kind of molded in with that whole genre of hair metal because they were kind of a part of that scene, but they were definitely more of a unique band than say Motley Crue or your Poison. A lot of those bands they started off kind of heavy, but then they started to roll into more of a commercial appeal. And I hear with Motley Crue especially, like, oh, the first two albums are great, but then after that they kind of went more really too commercial. While Dokken, they were able to ride the line between still being heavy and commercial. And I think as we get through the albums, we'll start to see, especially later on in the 80s, they always start to straddle that line perfectly.
They did, but somewhere along the line, I think they just missed that one song that people would forever remember them for. Like Quiet Riot had "Come On, Feel the Noise" and "Rats Got Round and Round." That one signature song. Dokken never really had that one song, so I think that's kept them from. They don't always get talked about when people talk about the great, hard rock bands from the '80s, and they were a great hard rock band.
Yeah, and unfortunately nowadays with Don Dokken's vocal faux pas and everything else going on there, it's kind of scarred the image a little bit. And especially if we go back to listen to the greatest hits album when they re-recorded, you could definitely see something wrong by that point. They're good re-recordings, but they just don't have the magic of the early material. And if we do get into that discussion later, it's just I wish they would have just put the songs on a greatest hits instead of just re-recording them.
Well, I understand why bands do that, though. It's because it would cost too much to license them from the original label. That's exactly why. If they do new recordings of them, they own those recordings. But yeah, a lot of it when bands do that has to do with what kind of shape is your vocalist in. And Don, unfortunately, his voice has not aged that well. He was fantastic through the 80s and most of the 90s. I saw them once in concert in 2000, and he still sounded pretty good. But yeah, I think that there's a little bit of legacy tarnishing. It's just my opinion now when he goes out, but he wants to do it and he's got the right to do it. It's his band. So,
Right?
so actually,
I see the
if we
line
want
either
to,
way.
if we want to get into the albums, actually, not, I mean, not everybody knows this. Dokken actually kind of predates the 80s a little bit.
Yeah, didn't they start in like 78, 79? I remember Dokken having going up to I believe he said Germany, going up to Hamburg.
Yeah, it's a complicated story about how he ended up in Hamburg and how he ended up recording, how he met Michael Wagner, who went on to become a famous hard rock metal producer in his own right. So in 1989, this company called Repertoire Records put this out, which is called Back in the Streets. And it's got the lineup listed on the back as the Dokken lineup from the first album, but it's not. Like I not 100% sure who all those guys are. I can pick out Don, but George Lynch isn't there. Mick Brown isn't there, and neither is Juan Crucier. There are 6 songs on here. 2 of them are live. There are 2 live songs on the end of this. One is actually called Prisoner, but it's a different song than the song Prisoner that appears on Back for the Attack. The song Felony is on here, which they re-recorded for Breaking the Chains. It's very, very different arrangement of it on here. And this one, I don't know how easy this is to find these days, but it really doesn't matter because the whole thing can be found on this that just came out. Actually, this only came out a couple of years ago. This is a Dokken The Lost Songs, 1978 to 1981. This has 11 songs on it, and 6 of those songs are the 6 songs on that Back in the Street. So, yeah, you've got the beginnings of that Dokken sound. It's actually a little poppier at this point, and there's different players on here. I don't think that the classic lineup is on all of these songs, and some of the recordings, like they were transferred from cassette, so they aren't the best. So the first Dokken album proper is Breaking the Chains, but as a lot of people know, that originally came out on Carrera Records in I think mostly in Europe, and it was Don Dokken. It says Don Dokken on it. It's got the Dokken logo, as we know, but it says Don Dokken. It's got a picture of him chained up against a wall. And it's different recordings than most people knew of 2 years later when Elektra released Breaking the Chains. Worth seeking out for curiosity value. Some of the songs have different lyrics, some have different titles, but most of the guts of the songs are there. But when Dokken came on most people's radar is with the reissued Breaking the Chains. It's one of my favorite logos, by the way. I've always liked this logo. This is a Canadian version of the first album. Not the easiest one to find, actually. It's got the maple leaf on there. That's how you know it's Canadian. And mine does not have a lyric sleeve with it. It's just got the red and black Elektra label on it. And I've also got the CD here. Now, it's hard to find these Elektra CDs now. Usually what you find are the Rock Candy reissues, which are great, but this is an Elektra CD. And the title song is definitely the best known song from Breaking the Chains. It ended up on a lot of compilations. They still play it live to this day. It's a staple, right? Got one of the Dokken are one of those bands. They made really, really bad videos, and this one might be the worst of them all. I would hate to think that someone's first exposure to Dokken would be seeing one of the videos because it might turn them off forever. Listen to the music. The music is good.
Yeah, for sure. I really enjoyed that first record. And I didn't know about that whole Don Dokken thing until I saw another YouTuber. She actually had the French pressing of that cover with him in the chains and trying to break out of them. I thought that was pretty cool. All
Yeah,
like
yeah, I don't
fathers
have
and
that.
idols.
It's really hard to find, and it's really expensive if you do find a copy for sale. Maybe someday. And apparently that was right next to like a fish shop, so it stank really bad when they were doing the photo session for that. So, yeah, so that album did not sell very well, or it didn't sell, didn't go gold. To this day, I don't think it ever went gold. And so Elektra Records were going to drop them. And after, like, at this point, Don had been struggling for over 5 years to try and make it. And I don't know a lot of people know this or not. Originally, Doc, his idea was to be a trio with him playing guitar and singing. No, just the one guitar player. You can go on YouTube and find clips of him performing on German TV, with him playing guitar and singing, and just bass player and drummer. So that was kind of an interesting thing. I didn't know that till just a few years ago. For instance, you can see him doing the song a lot of people know as Paris is Burning, which is a live version, is the last track on Breaking the Chains. It's actually the original version is just called Paris, and it's him live doing that song. So essentially what happened was he pleaded with the record company to give us one more chance. And it did end up paying off. And, what a lot of people consider the best Dokken album, or definitely the heaviest, is Tooth and Nail, 1984. If you have the cassette of this, and I don't have the cassette at this point, I used to, it's got a completely different cover. The cassette version of Tooth and Nail, for some reason, it's got this, like, this demon hand, but it's also got the mirror image of it going the other way. And that's what the cassette looks like. And until I first saw the record, when I first saw the record, I was like, wow, that's different. So this actually, they're spending a little bit more money. It's got a lyric sleeve. And by now, it's the band as most people would know. So it's Don Dokken, George Lynch, Jeff Pilson, and Mick Brown. This album contains several songs that would become Dokken standards in concert. Of course, Tooth and Nail, Just Got Lucky, When Heaven Comes Down, Into the Fire. And their first song that made inroads on the charts, the ballad Alone Again, which only got to number 64 on Billboard. That's their highest charting song. So like I said, they don't have that one song that your average radio listener from the 80s would recognize. This album was produced by Tom Werman, and I don't think it has that great a sound like a lot of Tom Werman productions. It's a little light. You can't really hear the bass that well, and it's a little I don't know. It's got a weird production sound to it. It doesn't sound like the Motley Crue records. It doesn't sound like the Cheap Trick records that he did. But I don't know. But great songs, and that's the main thing. And I love the cover art too. I love the hand coming out of it. It looks like there's fire underneath the water. I'm not sure what it means, but yeah, I really like it. And I've also got the CD and the US Elektra CD. This is all it looks like on the back. Basically, it's got everything in it that you'd want. So that takes us to this point. And then, as you already mentioned, it's my favorite Dokken album of the 80s by far, Under Lock and Key. Came out in 1985. And I agree with you. I think it's the perfect mix. I think there are songs on here that should have done well on the charts. Let's get this out of the way. Let's talk about the fashion here. I mean, a lot of bands fell victim to this in the 80s. And I think a lot of bands are better served if they didn't appear on the cover because, closed date. But it's kind of cool. I like the fact that you've got the Dokken logo is made into this, whatever this is, this.
Like a door.
Yeah, kind of coming out of the ground. And
it fits the theme of the album, Under Lock and Key. It kind of looks like
actually, this kind of
locking it.
Might have been cooler as the front cover and then just splatter the logo along the top. But this was a big album for them. So In My Dreams was the second song they had that hit the charts. I only got to number 72. It could have done more. It's more commercial. I hate to say the word popular, but it is. The Hunter's another great song. Don't Lie to Me could have been a single. Two ballads on here, Slipping Away and Jaded Heart. And then It's Not Love was another popular song off this, as was the opener, Unchain the Night. Two of their heaviest songs both end each side here, Till the Living End and Lightning Strikes Again, which is one of Don's best vocal performances.
For sure. I love how he hits the high notes on that one.
Yeah. And that's the great thing about it, with these guys getting up there in age. It's like, listen to what they did. Listen to the recorded, it captured them in the studio, what they were able to do. This is just the US CD. And I've also got this is a Canadian cassette of Under Lock and Key. And this album, oddly enough, is also out there somewhere. It was made on 8-track, believe it or not. Uh, RCA Music Service had Under Lock and Key manufactured on 8-track. I don't have it. It's highly collectible, really expensive, and just really, really scarce. But the fact that there's a Dokken 8-track out there and seems to be just this one album for whatever reason, that kind of tells me that they were selling more and more and more. So the demand was there. So they made it available. I think the idea of it is odd to me, a Dokken 8-track, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, hey, if I ever find a copy, I'll trade you an 8-track for one of your books.
Deal. You'd be coming up short on that deal, Tyler, because man, this goes for hundreds of dollars. But anyway, so the next thing, and I'd mentioned this at the beginning, the first thing I ever really heard by them was this. I've got this EP here. So this is the Dream Warriors EP from Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. This is just a Canadian cassette that I found. And what's cool about this, it's got a song on it called Back for the Attack. But this song is not on the album Back for the Attack unless you get a reissued version, but it wasn't on the original version. It's also got Paris is Burning on here, which is the version from Breaking the Chains, but it doesn't have George Lynch's guitar solo at the beginning of it. It just starts in when the double bass drums come in. Dream Warriors got a lot of attention for them. The video got a lot of play. I think musically it's really good. I just think it's We're the Dream Warriors. I think it's a little cheesy, but that could be said for a lot of songs that I love. So, they were commissioned to write a song for this movie. What's it called? Dream Warriors. All right, let's go. Robert Englund as Freddie was in the video. That got them a lot of attention. And I do believe that the video for the song actually is on the VHS of the Nightmare on Elm Street 3 movie when it came out. So a lot of people would know this song. They might not remember who did it. So that came out in early 1987. And that was followed up with another platinum album for them. So Tooth and Nail and Under Lock and Key both went platinum. Back for the Attack. I love this artwork. I think this is just really, really, really cool artwork. I could just love the colors. I could just look at that for hours. And the back cover is cool too.
Yeah, very artsy, the back cover. Like the front cover is very militaristic and like mission statement, and the back is just total like Van Gogh.
Yeah, this is like it's like a crest or a coat of arms. It's very cool. And the inner sleeve looks cool too. It's got some cool stuff on it.
Now, is that on one vinyl or two? Is that on one vinyl or two?
It's one, and it's a long record. It's got 13 songs on it. So it was at the time, like along with Def Leppard Hysteria, this was pushing the limits of how much music could be fit onto a single record. This is just a US pressing on Elektra with the red and black.
I was gonna say because I have the whole album on Spotify, and it's 13 songs. It's over an hour long. How does that fit on one piece of record? Do they?
I'm not sure. So so side one had 6 songs. Side 2 had 7. There's not a lot of gaps between the songs. Not a lot of spaces. So I'm not sure. Like I said, they must have really pushed it. This is the CD version. Of course, by now, bands are recording more songs on an album because they've got CDs and CDs hold more. And it's Canadian cassette. Even on cassette, this artwork looks really cool. So off of this album, Dream Warriors is the last song on here. It had already been out. Burning Like a Flame was the big single off this one. It did dent the Billboard chart. I think it peaked somewhere in the 80s. Also, the Heaven Sent, another ballad. Those were videos off this album. But this album is full of great songs. Kiss of Death is another really heavy one. Another great vocal performance from Dawn. Like I said, it's got the song Prisoner, which is not the same one that's on that Back in the Streets or the Lost songs. Standing in the Shadows, a great song. It's got George Lynch's guitar instrumental, Mr. Scary, which was his nickname. Cry the Gypsies, really good. Yeah, this is a good, strong album. And it went platinum too. This was kind of their peak of popularity because at this point they went on tour they never really got to that headlining status on their own, like headlining big arenas, but they opened for a lot of big bands. On this tour, they opened for Aerosmith, who were on their comeback with Permanent Vacation. So they got in front of a lot of people, probably was responsible for the album selling over 1 million copies, especially considering it didn't have a big hit single. Then in the summer of '88, they were on that Monsters of Rock tour that Van Halen headlined. Scorpions were on it, Kingdom Come were on it, and then this band Metallica that everybody was talking about. And Dokken had the misfortune of coming on after Metallica, who were coming on strong with And Justice for All. And it was at that point people wanted stuff that was heavier, and Dokken just, they weren't getting along and the performances weren't great. So it didn't really do them any favors being on that Monsters of Rock tour. I'm sure they made pretty good paycheck from it, but it would have been better if they'd have stayed with another, either with Aerosmith. I think Guns N' Roses had replaced them as the opening act for Aerosmith at this point. But anyway, a lot of people talk about that unfavorably, which is a shame. And by the end of 1988, that was pretty much it. I mean, especially Don Dokken and George Lynch never really got along. I think they get along better now, and George will make his occasional appearances on stage with them. But I mean, George would play with his back to the audience and like just bad vibes all around. But at the end of 1988, that was pretty much the end of Dokken. So the record company puts out a live album, because what else are you going to do? More really cool artwork. Beast from the East. This is a Canadian version of Beast from the East. Not the easiest one to find on vinyl either. And this is actually a gatefold, which by the late 80s, you weren't seeing a lot of gatefolds.
Yeah, gatefolds are my preferred, especially for a double album. It just
really this had one new track on it, the ballad Walk Away, one new studio track. And it's just good. It's got the tour dates that they did in Japan. They always did really, really well in Japan. And got the CD to this. Now, this is the original Elektra CD, which cuts out 3 songs to fit it on one CD. So they cut out Standing in the Shadows, Sleepless Night, and Turn on the Action. It's weird because it says the total time on here is 71:07, and I thought a CD could hold 78 minutes. So it seems to me they could have fit one more song on here. You can get deluxe editions of this with all the tracks on it, but I honestly don't care for this live album all that much, and it's one of the pet peeves I have with this band, because Don is a perfectly good guitar player, and he could have easily played the rhythm guitar while George soloed, because to me there's the problem. As soon as it goes into a solo, the bottom end just drops right out, because you get bass and drums and that's it, and you're missing the riffs behind it. Don could have played those, but George didn't want another guitar player on stage. So, they're kind of their own. They were kind of their own worst enemy. It's really surprising they did as well as they did. That album coming out as the band's breaking up still managed to go gold. So, they did all right. Like they did really, really well all the way throughout the 80s. And, they're people that, remember their music, remember them quite fondly to this day. And so what happened next is that Don, of course, so George Lynch and Mick Brown formed Lynch Mob, which has been in various incarnations. And they put out Wicked Sensation, which was a little heavier than Dokken. It still had some of those elements, because if you've got George Lynch and Mick Brown, there's half of Dokken. Jeff Pilson's done several things. He had several bands that he never really got off the ground. And really until he joined Foreigner many, many years later, and he's like now their musical director. Other than Dokken, there wasn't a lot. He produced, and he would be on this album, that album. But Don wanted to continue, and you would think that because it's his last name that he would have been able to just keep doing Dokken records and put a new band together. But the other 3 guys had a stake in it, I guess, and he could not put out an album under his own name. So in 1990, this comes out. It's Don Dokken, Up from the Ashes. Now, I have always considered this to be a Dokken album. I filed this right after Beast from the East. This is on Geffen Records, and Don assembled a really, really good band on here. And he's got them all pictured, which kind of tells you he wasn't thinking about a solo album. He was thinking about a band. So he's got John Norum on guitar, who had left Europe, would later go back to them. Peter Baltes from Accept, Mickey D, who played with King Diamond. He's been in the Scorpions, been in Motorhead, and a guitar player I've never really heard of since named Billy White. I think he was from Texas, and I think he was a lot younger. And they put out an album that sounds like, in my ears, the natural progression from Back for the Attack. It's a little less heavy. It's more pop oriented on some songs, but there are great songs on here, like the opener, Crash and Burn. Thousand Miles Away totally sounds like a Dokken song. The song Stay totally sounds like a Dokken song. It was even co-written by Mick Brown. So, you kind of can't help but sound like Forever's a good song, Living Alive. This is a good album, and I consider it a Dokken album. Some people will disagree with me on that, but it sounds like not just because of Don's vocals, but musically, it sounds like these are songs that a Dokken album would have on them in 1990.
It
I
definitely
only
has
other have
that
one
Dokken
thing,
DNA in it too.
huh?
I have that Dokken DNA in it. It definitely sounds like a
Oh, yeah,
progression
for sure,
for
for
sure.
sure.
I really like that one quite a bit. I actually like that one more than Back for the Attack. There's just something about that. There's really cool theme to it. I always thought that Back for the Attack was kind of overly long. Like they went from a 40-minute long record right into an hour and change. They
Yeah,
didn't do that progressive step like Rush did. They progressively made their albums longer. They went right into it. A lot of bands in the later '80s did that. It's like, oh, CD, we're gonna fill it right up just
yeah.
about, and it just way too long. I like
The
how it starts. I like the ending, but then you could cut a couple songs from the middle part, and I think it'd be even better record because for that.
I kind of agree with you on that because I think there's 13 songs. If they'd have made that just a nice lean 10-song album, 5 songs on each side, yeah, it would have been really solid. After a while, it just no matter how good the songs might be, after a while you just want to put something else on. I find that. But yeah, every band was doing that. Now, one thing CDs were, CDs were great for a lot of things. They were great for compilations, for compiling songs. But yeah, bands did fall into the trap. I always call it, because I'm a Kiss fan, I always call it hot in the shade syndrome, where we get 15 songs, put them all on there instead of saying, hey, do we really want, yeah, there's a lot of music here, but is it all good? Can we trim this back a little bit? The only other thing I want to talk about actually didn't come out until 1994, and it didn't come out in North America, although I think it was going to. I think it was meant to. Show you what I mean. It's just called The Best of Dokken. This is on Elektra, and this is a Japanese CD. And the reason that I got this, so this is the spine of it in Japanese. I'm assuming it says The Best of Dokken there somewhere. This is what it looks like in English. The reason I think that it was going to come out in the States, this will never show up, but down here on the bottom corner, very, very small print, it's got a serial number, and the serial number is 7559-61685-2. Now, if you look at Elektra Records albums from this time period, they were using the 60,000 series. For example, like Beast from the East is 60823. If you look at the Motley Crue album from '94 with John Corabi, it's in the 61,000 series. I think this was very close to being released in North America, and at the last minute it didn't. But it was given a serial number. That's my feeling about this. But the only reason I bought this, I mean, it's a good compilation, but this has the song Back for the Attack on it. And this was before the Rock Candy reissues of Back for the Attack came out that had that song on it. So gave it its title track. So I bought it here because it had that song on it. But this is a good introduction to 80s Dokken. I mean, it's got all the highlights that you could ever want. So yeah, I mean, it's good stuff. I mean, it's just before we came on this morning, I re-listened to Breaking the Chains and Tooth and Nail. It's like, yeah, I still like this. I think this stuff still holds up.
I agree. I really enjoy Tooth and Nail and Under Lock and Key the most. Like that middle era is great. And I
Yeah.
actually was listening to Back for the Attack, and I remember like listening to some of it and just getting kind of bored by the middle. But if you skip towards the end, the last few songs are great, and I love Mr. Scary, how heavy that is. And that record actually is a little more heavy than Under Lock and Key in spots. It really kind of comes back to the Tooth and Nail era. So I thought that was nice.
Yeah.
And the thing is, too, a lot of these Dokken records, they never really got any kind of vinyl reissue. I know you can
No.
find Breaking the Chains is still available. They made like a red one of that. And Tooth and Nail got a really small vinyl reissue. But other than that, for some reason, they haven't reissued any other ones on vinyl, and I'm waiting to, get a copy of those. And I'm normally someone who buys new reissues, but I might have to go on eBay and find like a really good looking, BG plus copy just to have them on vinyl because I want to hear what these albums sound like through my speakers.
I think that that's another thing to do with that not having really big hit singles on the pop charts like a lot of the bands did. People forget about them. And, yeah, because they were on Elektra, I'm really surprised that Rhino Records hasn't put out, at least the first four, the albums that most people had back in the day, or the live album too. And maybe they will. Maybe they will eventually. I know that some of the later ones came out on vinyl, but that's another story for another time.
Right, for sure. We'll have to do a part two of this, Tim.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. It was great talking to you about one of my favorite 80s bands, Dokken. If you want to check out Tim the Vinyl Confessions, he's on YouTube, all social media. I'll actually link his channel in the description below. And again, thanks for being on my channel, Tim.
Thank you very much, Tyler. It was a lot of fun. I'm going to go listen to some more Dokken now.
All right, I'm going to do the same. Have a great afternoon.